This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. Happy holidays, everybody. I'm doing this show on December 23rd, so we're practically to Christmas. And I'm going to be doing mostly a retrospective of my life and maybe my mom's as well, family sorts of things, which are so important this time of year. I was born on June 20th, 1932, lots of twos in that date. And my mother was Lois Elizabeth Hatch Dymel Washburn, and I am Lois Elizabeth Dymel Whaley. You see, my mother was expecting someone named John, and I rather surprised her, so she just named me after herself. Actually, my daughter, Alice Ann, without an E, her second daughter is named Alice Ann with an E. So that's a kind of a tradition in our family. Sometimes just naming a child after yourself. I have brought with me my necklace, which is something that people have noticed about me quite often and commented on. My necklace has charms on it from over the years, so many years, and I'll be explaining how those give the story of my life. The very first charm here is really my mother's wedding ring. She was not a slight person, but she was about the same size I am. We are the shortest women in our family. And she had very thin fingers. So in 1923, when she was married, September 28th, 1923, she had this actually platinum, very thin silver band, which is engraved, of course, as they often do with the date. That was a significant date in her family, not only for her wedding to Edgar Bertram Dymel, but also because it was the exact 25th anniversary of her parents' wedding. And I have here in the write-up that I made for my mother some years ago. She's been gone since 1959 herself. But in the write-up I have some pictures of her. And among other things, there is her wedding dress, which was her mother's wedding dress in 1898, since she was married on the 25th exact anniversary of her parents' wedding. Elizabeth Mary Ranney, who wore this dress in 1898, had her daughter Lois wear the dress on her wedding day in 1923. Well, these early charms have something to do with my life, not just the fact that my parents were married, of course, with the wedding ring here, but here's a good luck charm with green, a green four-leaf clover. And one of the things that happened early in my lifetime, I was born in New York City, in Manhattan actually, was that when I was only 9 months old, we moved to Nevada. So here is a roulette wheel. I see over the years it's gotten kind of faded and so on, but it still moves, and it has a little ball inside like a roulette wheel. it was early in the 1930s that gambling became legal in the state of Nevada. And here is a charm which shows Nevada, where I went when I was age 9, all the way down to the very southern part, not too far from Las Vegas, actually. Pahrump, where we lived when I was a baby, was about halfway between Las Vegas and Death Valley. So there's the Nevada charm that I'm pointing to. And let's see, what else should I tell you about those early days? Well, I want to point out first these round, you see there are 1, 2, 3 round charms here, and there are a couple more down in this part of the necklace, because this necklace was something that I found on a train in Europe in 1967. And it had on it these little silver farthings from countries, mostly from Sweden, but there are a couple also from Norway. And since it was on a train and sort of abandoned, who knew where it came from, I took it along, and I've had it ever since 1967, and I've been working on the charms ever since then. Well, here's a charm from about the time I was 7 or 8. There were 2 years that we went to San Francisco. So this is a San Francisco city charm, which shows, of course, a cable car on it. My father, Edgar B. Daimel, was actually born in San Francisco, and one of his brothers was living there when we visited. By that time, my father had passed away, actually, but I was able to visit with Uncle Phil Daimel in San Francisco and go to the San Francisco World's Fair in 1940, actually. So I always thought San Francisco was a pretty wonderful place, and I still think so today, even though we're living far away from there now. Well, the next charm is a little grand piano. How can a grand piano be little? Well, it can be little if it's actually a little silver charm like that. The piano that I learned to play in Tonopah, Nevada, starting when I was about 7, was not a grand piano. It was one of the old-fashioned upright pianos, which was in the house right across from ours, where we lived on the big side of a hill in Tonopah, which is a silver mining town begun in the year 1900. And my piano teacher was a woman who came originally from the Dakotas. All this I learned actually many years later. But she was a wonderful piano teacher, and many, many generations of children and older folks had learned piano from Mrs. Porter, who was actually a black woman. She was a graduate of Oberlin College, and that was something I only learned many years later. But she was a wonderful teacher and a wonderful person. Let's see, what do we have next here? Well, I guess this is sort of to illustrate my long-term interest in peace. You know, I remember quite well the Second World War, because I was 9 years old when the Second World War began in 1941 for the United States. But of course it had begun several years earlier in Europe. And so that's, you might say, symbolic of peace, which hopefully follows war and hopefully lasts much longer than war, the peace. I don't know, you know, we've had long times of war. We've had war essentially someplace ever since 2001 and the attack in New York in Washington, D.C., and in Pennsylvania, at least one of the 4 planes that was part of the 2001 9/11 emergency. One of the planes landed in Pennsylvania. Well, let's see. Let's go back to earlier history. This is this is the oldest personal thing, except for my mother's wedding ring that I have on my necklace. That's a red S for Stanford. And this being the time of year when we're wearing red things, and I'm wearing my red shirt that says "Hello, Dolly," because I was called Dolly. That was my nickname when I was a girl. And I have here my red bag from Stanford, which has a big S on it, and the Stanford redwood tree. This is my something from having been a member ever since graduating in 1951 of the Stanford Alumni Association. My mother bought me a membership for, I think it was $50 back in 1951. They're considerably more expensive now. But she had wanted me to go to Stanford. My father, Edgar Daimel, had lived nearby in Los Altos and had attended Palo Alto High School, at least his senior year. He had attended Palo Alto High School right at the end of the First World War. So she was very set on me going to Stanford, which I did from 1948 to 51. Now, let's see what next we have here. Well, there's a charm which is showing an Indian symbol here. Indians were American Indians, I'm talking about, of course, were very important to my childhood. Where we lived at Pahrump, there were a lot of Southern Paiutes living down there, and my nursemaid that took care of me when I was a baby and a toddler and so on was an Indian woman, also named Alice, which is a popular name in our family. Her name was Alice Jim, and she's only recently passed away, about 90 years old. So I knew Indians from the very beginning of my life in Nevada, and later on I taught on an Indian reservation in northern Nevada. That was after my finishing college, of course, in 1952-53. So let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, well, this really symbolizes, I think, my husband, whom I met at the University of Michigan in January 1954. His name, as you know, is Bob Whaley. He also has and this is a kind of a whale that, one of those small whales that lives in the Puget Sound, Orcas, near Orcas Island, where my Stanford roommate, Flossie Sprague Bullock, lives and has lived for many years. But the name Whaley, although it's spelled with an EA, just like President Reagan and just like the great steak that people like to eat, is an EA with a long A sound. Anyway, we met in Michigan, and here is my charm of Michigan. I don't have a charm from New York or New York State, but I do have one from Michigan, where I met my husband Bob in 1954, and we were married in July of 1954 after about 6 months getting acquainted. The next charm here is a former earring. Unfortunately, earrings tend to get lost. And this is the remaining earring, which was given to me by my husband. A set of earrings, obviously, originally, but I've put it, the one that's left, on my charm bracelet here. So we were married in 1954, and he was almost immediately inducted into the Army. Well, it was January 1955, about a year after we first met, that he was drafted at the very end of the Korean crisis. Actually, there had been a sort of a temporary peace arrangement signed in the summer of 1954, and there never has been a final peace treaty signed for Korea and the Korean War. But he went into the Army in January 1955, and then we moved to Fort Knox after he had finished his basic training, and that was in artillery. In those days, they still had artillery. Now they have missiles, you know, guided missiles, as opposed to the old field artillery guns and so on. But in 1955, they were just beginning to think missiles. So he went into the service then, and eventually went overseas, and I taught at Fort Knox for a year there. I taught children of officers, both commissioned officers and non-commissioned officers. And that was interesting because it was the first and really the only time that I ever lived, quote, in the South, because, of course, Fort Knox is on the southern side of the Ohio River, where slavery continued until the end of the Civil War, the American Civil War, while the northern side, the northern side of the Ohio River became the Free State of Ohio under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So that was the first time when I lived in Kentucky that I saw things like drinking fountains labeled colored and white, and black people were expected to drink from the colored fountains in Kentucky in those days in 1955, 56. But you'll notice from that date that that was after the passage of Board versus Brown versus Board of Education, which Supreme Court decided that segregated schools, so-called separate schools, were inherently unequal. We seem to be going back to the old style just because of the importance of the requirement for the people to live in the area where the elementary schools are located. That's a long-standing tradition in this country. And we have so much segregated housing, most of it actually now not legally segregated as it once was in this country, but segregated by choice of residents, and also by some shenanigans done by banks and so on to keep segregation going. Well, we went to Germany, and actually way down on this part of my necklace is a charm from Germany, not from 1955, but from, or from 1956, but from 11 years later when we went back to Germany when my husband was doing some of his research on the Spanish Civil War and the intervention by Nazi Germany in favor of the Franco people in the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. And that's Grand Ballon, which is actually in France. And I took my little son, David, who has just turned 55, and in those days he was only 6 years old when we visited in 1967. Well, his brother was away at a camp. His brother was a couple years older, and he was only 8, really. But I thought of him as a rather grown-up young man. And so we sent him to a camp that was a German camp. And the poor guy later told me, you know, many years later actually, that he had been afraid at first because he was only 8 and we had left him at this camp for a week. He was afraid he was going to be there forever, which of course he wasn't, of course. He was only there for a week. But it was during that week that his younger brother, David, and I took a trip to France and went to Grand Ballon, and I got that charm. But that represents Germany for our lives. We've been quite associated with Germany, first because my husband was there, stationed in Stuttgart for a year from 1955 to 56, and because we visited again when he did research in 1967, and he has made several trips back. And we were there briefly in 1983. In 1983, we went to Berlin to a seminar, and we even went to East Berlin. Those were the days before the wall came down. 1983 was about 6 years before the wall came down. And I remember that trip to East Berlin quite well because I got separated from all the other folks finally on the train. I said, here's the place we're supposed to get off if we're going to go to the Historical Museum. And the other people said, no, that isn't the right place. So I got off anyway and found myself in an absolutely deserted, flat part of Berlin, which had not been yet rebuilt. Today it's rebuilt, but in those days there was this huge territory of probably 180 acres or so, right in the heart of old Berlin, that was absolutely bare of anything. But I could see Unter den Linden Avenue off in the distance, and I went across, but it had been one of those, and then there were none things, as I thought, as I crossed that bare space in the middle of East Berlin, and didn't see a single person, of course, until I got over to Unter den Linden, which has always been an important part of Berlin, and was the part where the Hitler buildings, many of the Hitler buildings were, and that was one of the reasons why that part of Berlin had not been built, the part that was on the other side of Unter den Linden. Well, I got to the Historical Museum and the other folks didn't, so there. I was able to see an absolutely magnificent exhibit because it was the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism. And they had brought, since he was born in 1383, they had brought things from all over East Germany to put on exhibit at the museum in East Berlin. And I guess I was the only person from our group. There were only 1 or 2 others who even made it to the Historical Museum in East Berlin. So anyway, Germany has been an important part of our lives, for sure. Well, let's go back to an earlier time here. Let's see. Okay. one thing that happened was that when I initially got this bracelet, of course, I put some things along it, and since then I filled it in with a lot of other materials, so you have some kind of different things. For instance, here is a boat which represents the time that it's a steam, old-fashioned paddle boat, steamer kind of thing, which represents the Ohio River and the fact that we moved to Ohio in 1964. And later I served on the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission as a representative of the state of Ohio for about 8 years. So that's the Ohio part there. Now let's see. We should begin pretty soon to be, let me talk about having been to England, because after my husband finished his service, we went to England for a year. He was a student at Oxford University in England for a year. And I do have one of these things here is a charm from England. I think this is the one. Yeah, it's a farthing. It's a farthing from England. And it shows George VI on the other side. Of course, by the time we were in England in 1956, Queen Elizabeth had been queen for a number of years, 3 or 4 years, but this charm, which is a farthing or a fourth of a penny, they weren't even using them anymore in England when we were there, so I guess that's why they made them into charms. This shows George VI on this side, so it does date from the 1950s when we were in England at Oxford that year. Well, then we returned to the States and went back to Michigan, and Bob, who had finished his master's degree in history in 1954, began work on his PhD at the University of Michigan, and we were there for 2 years. In 1959, the first of our children was born. We had purposely postponed having a family for a while, which is one of the reasons why I have always been very grateful to Planned Parenthood, who initiated us into family planning, and Michigan, actually, when we were first married. So we didn't have our first child until we were there in 1959 in Michigan again, when our son Richard William, named for his 2 uncles, Bob's brother Richard and my brother William, when he was born in April of 1959. And then we moved almost immediately, later that summer, to Washington, D.C., where Bob began doing research for his dissertation on German intervention in the Spanish Civil War. So there's my charm from Washington, D.C., and my charm, which shows my son, my older son. We called him Dickie when he was little. And of course, now he's almost 57. I guess maybe he is 57 if he was born in 59. And while we were in Washington, D.C., we had a second son who was about 18 months younger than Dickie. And that was our son, David John Whaley, who lives right here in Athens, Ohio, and it's very nice that we have a grandson right here in Athens. Well, these charms sort of relate to David, who later went to the University of Virginia. This is a charm that he and his wife got me when they visited the University of Virginia one time for a college reunion that David had. And I think there's another little charm here, probably underneath somewhere, which is a tiny head, which is the charm for our grandson, Reese, who is 6 years old now and lives here. This is David's charm I'm pointing to right now, but I know that Reese's charm is somewhere nearby here. Well, after Washington, D.C., Bob got his first teaching job, which is at the University of Maine in Orono, Maine, and we were there for 3 years. And while we were there, our daughter Alice Ann without the E, was born. She was born in Bangor, Maine, and we just barely made it to the hospital because Bangor was 15 miles away, and Alice was a little bit early. In fact, each of my 3 children was a little bit early. She was the earliest. She was 9 days before the due date, and so there I was at 4 a.m. saying, oh goodness, this couldn't be true, because I had to do a lot of things like wash some diapers, since we still had some children in diapers, before we could leave for Bangor. And she was born 5 minutes after I got out of the elevator at the hospital, and believe me, I thought she was going to be born in the elevator. Well, that's one of those adventures that mothers never forget, believe me. So Alice was born in May 1963, and then that December we went down to Delaware, and I do have a Delaware charm here somewhere, because that's where we visited Bob's parents. They had moved from New York down to Delaware, and so Alice spent her first Christmas when she was just 6 months old or thereabouts, in part of the time at least, in Delaware with her 2 older brothers, and we were able to be with Bob's parents for Christmas. And during New Year, we went up to Philadelphia, stayed with college friends, and Bob interviewed for a new job and was recommended to Ohio University by the late Dr. John Cady of the History Department, who was a specialist on Burma, now known as Myanmar. So in the fall of 1964, we moved to Athens into the Northwest Territory, north of the Ohio River, and we've lived here basically ever since, although we've taken some trips, as I mentioned, to Germany in 1967. We were in England for a whole year in 1970-71, having left in the summer after Ohio University was closed due to the fallout from Kent State University on May 4th, 1970, when 4 students at Kent State were killed by Ohio National Guardsmen during protests of the Vietnam War. My husband and I, being specialists in a sense on war, are very, very much in favor of peace, and we were during the Vietnam War too. Well, let's see, what do we have here next? Let's see, well, here's another, there is another earring, the mate of which was lost, alas, somewhere along the line. But that represents my dear friends from New York City, Michael and Marianne Fleming, because Michael Fleming got this set of earrings for me when he was living in Cuba. That was before, of course, the takeover of the expropriation of American property in Cuba by the Castro regime. But it's got a green, pretty green stone in it, and you may notice that I'm wearing my green stone bracelet, which was a 10-year-old birthday present from my mother. Let's see if I can show it here. Let's see, do I need to morpho? There we go. It's an Indian, as you can see. I've just had it repaired after these many years, 73 years or so. It finally broke, and I just had it repaired here in Athens, and it's back in use. Well, of course, I have a charm for Alice, which is here somewhere. I don't think that's it. I think that's that's David's charm. Yeah, that's David's charm. Actually, it's interesting. David's charm looks more like Dick, and Dick's charm looks more like David. But you can't tell about things like that, how they're going to. This is Alice's charm right there. So, okay. Well, looks like we're getting kind of to the end here. In a way, we are, but in another way, we aren't. This charm, for instance, represents a tiny ring that I got to commemorate Bob's and my 40th wedding anniversary. Our 40th wedding anniversary was in 1994, and we have since celebrated our 60th wedding anniversary last year in 2014. Here is a charm which I got to commemorate my master's degree in political science, which was in 1975, actually. And down here at the other end, this Phi Kappa Phi key represents my third master's degree, which I got in social science in 2007. So let's see, what else do we have here? Well, here's a little heart, which is a memento of Alice's wedding to Michael Ovidiu Dediu, who was a refugee from Romania with his parents in the 1980s and met Alice when she was a graduate student at University of California, Berkeley. They were married in 1988, and of course I have a grandson who is 24. He just turned 24 on December 21st. Let's see what else we need to resurrect here from past time. So I don't know that we need to resurrect much of anything else, except I do want to talk to you a little bit about this charm, which is from the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. This being Christmas time, that's the time when we have guests at your table at Unitarian Universalist churches all over the country. And this is this year's box for guests at your table, which this year commemorates refugees. The lady I'm holding up here was a refugee who was saved from war-torn Europe 75 years ago in December 1940. She was just a little girl, of course, then. She's 75 years old, much older now. But She became a teacher of Russian at the famous MIT University in Boston. She was one of the refugee children that was brought by the Unitarian Service Committee, which was founded in 1940, actually. And in December 1940, she and this man, who of course was a little boy then, I think he was only 5 or something like that then, were refugees from war-torn Europe, both Jewish, I believe. But Martha Sharp was one of the people who went to Europe to help save refugees or in any way help out with refugees. One of the things she did was get milk for children who were interned in concentration camps in France during 1940. And she and her husband had both traveled the previous year to Czechoslovakia. In 1939, they went to Czechoslovakia. Why Czechoslovakia? Well, there is a connection between the Unitarians and the Czechs in that the largest Unitarian church in the world in the 1930s was located in Prague, Czechoslovakia. And the minister there was the founder of an idea which we still commemorate today in Unitarian Universalist churches, flower communion during the springtime. And his church had 6,000 members in Prague. That's why it was the largest one in the world at the time. He was later interned by the Germans, who took over Prague in March of 1939, you know. And that was when the American Unitarians had sent Martha Sharp and her husband, the Reverend Waitstill Sharp, to Czechoslovakia to try to help the Unitarians there in Prague. But they had to leave, you know, a couple of jumps ahead of the Gestapo in the summer of 1939, and they were sent back the following year by what became the Unitarian Service Committee in 1940 to help out. As I mentioned, Martha Sharp was the one who actually brought 29 children, including the 2 elderly people who are shown on this box, to the United States as refugees in December of 1940, 75 years ago this year. So that is what they call Guest at Your Table, and it's a fundraiser essentially for the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. Most churches and religious organizations have some kind of fundraiser for social concerns or for sometimes for proselytizing. UUSC doesn't do any proselytizing, but we do have partners around the world who try to help out in places like Haiti and the Philippines, where there have been terrible natural disasters like hurricanes or typhoons, that sort of thing. And also on my box here, there is a picture of one of the partners in the Philippines who has helped with the typhoon situation. In 2013, they had the worst typhoon ever to hit the Philippines, which kicked up waves, you know, 13 feet high, which, and just this last year, there have been something like 6 hurricanes, typhoons, in the Philippines. And what this young woman does, she was in an area that was hit by this terrible 2013 typhoon. she has helped to train people, and it's a darn good thing, too, when you consider that they had 6 typhoons in 2015. She has been training people to help folks who are traumatized by these terrible events. It's not so much, of course they need physical things, blankets and clothing and food and that sort of thing, but they also need help with the trauma which is caused by these natural disasters. And that's what this young woman pictured on our guest at your table box here has done in the Philippines. Well, now I want to talk for a while about my mother, because her birth anniversary is coming up soon. She was born January 11th, 1902 in Kansas. Her parents had both come out to Kansas. Well, her father actually went to Kansas as a Baptist minister in 1897, and in 1898 he married, his name was Elmer Ellsworth Hatch, and he was a graduate of the University of Chicago. In fact, the first class, he was number 550 or something like that of the students who began the University of Chicago in 1893, 94. Anyway, her mother had been born in Kansas from 2 parents, one of whom had come from the Hudson River, Catskill. That was my great-grandmother, Mary Josephine Manning, and my great-grandfather, who was actually right from Ohio. He was born in 1846 on January 8th. So both my great-grandfather Hatch and my mother, born Lois Hatch in Kansas, were January birthday people. My mother, and I have some pictures here that shows her at various times of her life. I'll put this over here where we see the pictures, where we see the necklace. Okay, let's see. Well, we've seen the picture of her in her wedding dress. This is a picture of her when she was a little girl, maybe about 6, I would say, just judging by the looks. She was about 6. My mother in her wedding dress is shown with her 2 husbands. My father, Edgar B. Diemel, who was in the, he was a student at the University of California. I see I'm moving it the wrong direction here. But here he is in the hills around Berkeley, about 1920 when they met. And they were divorced in 1936. And the other picture on the other side of my mother in a wedding dress is my stepfather, George Washburn. And he was a California native, but his parents had moved to Nevada in 1903. They went by covered wagon. You know, people were still going places in covered wagons in 1903. And he went from California to Nevada in that. He was a wonderful man and a wonderful father, my stepfather, George Washburn. And of course, he's the father of my half-brother, William Du Bois Washburn, born in 1942. Well, let's see. There are some later pictures of my mother here, too, which I will at least point to. This one shows her in Mexico, because when she married my father, Edgar Diemel, he was working in Mexico. He had dropped out of the University of California, and he was working in Mexico at that time. And then here she is in the middle. This is the way I remember her best. She wore her hair in a French roll. They were quite popular in 1940, I think, and she wore it that way for about 5 or 6 years. When she was teaching, mostly, she was teaching during the war, although for a while she worked in the hiring department of the Employment Service in Hawthorne, Nevada, where they made ammunition for the Navy during World War II. And then after my brother's birth, and she wasn't able to work anymore, and they hired a man to do it. She had been working in the Employment Service for the federal government for 2 or 3 years already, which was why she had hired people at Hawthorne before. But after my brother was born, of course, that was kind of tough. And they were busily hiring men, mostly men, at Hawthorne for the war time. And then on this final picture of her shows her after she fell out of a tree on her parents' place near Lodi, California. There were at one time walnut trees all around the edges. English walnuts, wonderful tasting nuts that I remember very fondly from my childhood. Anyway, she had gone down there sometime in the 1950s, and the walnuts were ripe, and she climbed the tree and shook down some walnuts, and she fell out herself, and she's wearing her arm in a bandana because she broke her wrist. And of course, we had to kid her about doing that. But that's one of the oldest pictures I have of her, or the picture that she was the oldest, because unfortunately she died of cancer in September of 1959. She was only 57, and I was lucky enough to get out there to see her on her very last day of life in September of 1959 with my baby son, Dickie. So she had a chance to play, she could barely talk, of course, but she had a chance to play piggy toes on his little toes when he was only about 4 months old in 1959. Well, I want to share with you also her last letter. She had beautiful handwriting. Wish I had inherited it. But this was her last letter, written just a week before she died, and I will read it to you. It's dated September 3rd, 1959. Dear sister, did anyone tell you I am dying? A couple of weeks ago, the doctor here gave me 2 months. Yesterday, he shortened the time, but I don't know by how much. Anyway, Daddy George thought you ought to know beforehand so you could decide whether or not to trek west and be with me in my last days. For little Dickie's sake, whose life is all before him while mine is gone, I hope you will not attempt the trip, but will mind your own family's wants. Personally, I think George feels the need of you more than I. He weeps and weeps. My brother-in-law Ed and sister Joe came up Saturday. Lots of love and health and success to you and Bob in life. I've loved being you. I've loved having you for a daughter, your mother. This is on her stationery for Mutual of Omaha. She was selling insurance and real estate at the time, as well as working on the ranch. She often did the irrigation on the ranch in Fallon. But she'd had a very interesting life. One of the things that she did was serve in the Nevada legislature. This is a picture of her that was taken in the summer of 1936 before she ran for the Nevada legislature. She ran that fall, and she was elected from Nye County, which was at the time the second largest county in the whole United States. So these are pictures of my mother and stories of my mother, who was a wonderful mother and also a wonderful person. So here's a picture of me in my Hello Dolly t-shirt, which I'm wearing today, with my baskets from Nevada. And these pictures, you can see, was taken some time ago. I think it was probably taken in 1989, probably taken in 1989. Hello, Dolly. And that represents my life here in Ohio, in a sense. You know, I was on the school board in the 1980s and got this Hello Dolly t-shirt in the year that Hello Dolly was the musical. It was done at Athens High School. And I'm holding my Indian baskets here, especially the little one, which was from Pahrump, made when I was a baby. I talked about that recently, I think, with you folks. This is a better picture of it, with our piano in the background. This was my mother's piano that she bought in San Francisco in 1940, and which I still have today. So, what with New Year's coming up, I hope that everyone is going to be having a really nice holiday season, and you'll be seeing these pictures during the holiday season sometime of my story of my mother and myself and my necklace, which represents my life, my lifetime, and my talking to you about the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee on its 75 years, which we are celebrating this year at this time. Guest at your table. This is Lois Whaley for women today and yesterday. Happy holidays, everybody. Happy New Year, 2016, just coming up. You can tell I was born in the 1900s because of the way I talk sometimes, forgetting at age 83 that we are now in the 20s and still thinking about 1900s, 1932, when I was born, 1959, when my mother died. But best to everyone for 2016 coming up. Lois Whaley for women today and yesterday.